Hi, hello, and annyeonghaseyo. Today, I will be reviewing and discussing the South Korean film A Frozen Flower. As my first historical drama for this channel, A Frozen Flower creates a moment for discussion of representation and genre. Films set in the past, near or distant, can provide fresh ways to examine, experience, and affirm queerness. For context, many anti-LGBTQ bigots, regardless of country, like to frame non-cisgender, non-heterosexual identities as exclusively choices, as mental illnesses, as sins, etc., but also as a recent trend, phenomenon, or ideology. Therefore, it can be contained, kept out of books, off television, in movies, and away from young people, in order to be marginalized until the trend passes or the ideology is exiled. Now let's say you were to Google the US Embassy in Seoul, South Korea. You may come across photos or videos of Christian bigots protesting outside. Their trigger being the embassy showing any perceived or actual support for or solidarity with the LGBTQ+ community. Moreover, the source of their grievance is that they consider homosexuality to be a sin, and largely a result of Western influence, or quite literally a Western import like Subway and Marvel movies. Is this ironic because Christians in Korea are decrying the evils of a supposedly Western import even though their religion itself is actually a Western import? Yes. Yes, it is. But my point is that in their deeply prejudiced and openly hostile beliefs, LGBTQ+ people did not exist in the past, do not belong in the present, and must not live in the future. Sounds like some dangerous thinking, to put it mildly. This, of course, is not limited to Korea, as homophobia and transphobia have in vicious cycles throughout the world been weaponized to persecute and prosecute individuals and communities by deliberately and falsely framing them as existential threats of the now and of the national. Therefore, you could see why films that challenge that narrative can be valuable and interesting. Kings, queens, Vikings, samurai, pirates, cowboys, artists, 50, 100, 500 years ago and beyond, all manner of queer, trans, non-binary, gender fluid, and non-conforming peoples have lived. And watching those lives included and portrayed on screen through mediums as popular and widely seen as film and television is exciting stuff. It can be affirming and powerful. Yes, people who felt like me and connected like me existed back then too, whenever and wherever that may be. Because regardless of comparatively more recent developments in identification, terminology, and political organization, existence and resistance are simply not up for debate. Men liking men, women liking women, people living as their gender rather than their assigned sex, and people who don't live the binaries to begin with are as old as humans, even if terms like gay, lesbian, or trans are not. All of the films I've reviewed as yet, and most LGBT or queer Korean films, are contemporary set films. Therefore, I pose a question. What does A Frozen Flower have to say about historical queerness? How will it portray those feelings, desires, and experiences? The answer is not very well. Let's jump in, shall we? A Frozen Flower is a historical erotic drama, following an unexpected love triangle among a king, a queen, and the king's lover, a royal guard, all enmeshed in a crisis of succession and the treacherous plottings of the Yuan-influenced Goryeo court. Officially released in 2008, A Frozen Flower is the fifth feature film for director Ji-hyo, a seasoned, critically well-regarded, and commercially successful filmmaker. Yu also penned the script. As his first foray into historical drama, Yu himself expressed a lack of familiarity and certain discomfort with the genre, which is made obvious after watching the film. He also called the film a love story between men, which is a laughably preposterous description of a frozen flower. More likely, the commercial reliability of Yu as a filmmaker, combined with the runaway success of The King and the Clown, another historical drama with a queer storyline released just 3 years earlier, was the reason this film was made. Before the production was even completed, multiple countries purchased theatrical rights to the film for distribution. A Frozen Flower had a wide theatrical release to the domestic audience starting December 30th, 2008, going on to gross $19,407,433, and rack up 3,748,767 admissions. The film was a mainstream commercial hit, earning its budget of $10 million back and more, and becoming the sixth most attended film that year and continuing its success well into 2009. A Frozen Flower screened at many international film festivals and garnered numerous nominations and some accolades from prestigious Korean awards institutions. As you can see from the viewer response, from a fairly large sample size, most ratings indicate a strong to positive reaction to A Frozen Flower. English language reviews were a different story. The reception I could locate reflects a more middling or mixed reaction to the film, some complimenting the costumes and the cinematography, while others found it cheap-looking. Some praised the performances, while others found them a bit mechanical. Some criticized the film for being too cliched. Overall, it's mostly a meh response that acknowledges that the film has interesting elements, but is also incredibly uneven. Altogether, I'm giving A Frozen Flower a D+, which does put me in the minority of viewer responses. But based on what this movie is, it set 3 basic expectations. It'll be historical, it'll be erotic, and it'll be dramatic. Now, I'm aware most people aren't going into the film with the intent or background of examining its representation choices, nor are they looking for historical accuracy. Therefore, I'm not factoring that into my grade, but I will discuss it in greater detail later in this video. Okay, back to our basics. Is the film historical? Technically, yes. Insofar that the plot takes place in the past in a point in history, yeah, it bare minimum counts. In terms of historical accuracy, they take a ton of creative liberties, the timeline is significantly fabricated, and it mostly draws from a few historical events, which it then sews together for a story. Again, most people aren't considering historicity in a historically set film, but regardless, despite this film's large budget for production design, costumes, sets and locations, and extras, nothing about this film made me feel either immersed in or transported to another time. It doesn't take advantage of the tension inherent to historical films, which is usually created by living in times that are more conservative, more hierarchical, and more traditional, and consequently more regimented and restrained. In the cinematic recreation of a time of manners, rules, and etiquette, especially when a story focuses on the ruling classes, you can see that rigidity in their addressal, language, clothes, settings, and in their comportment of their bodies. Tension and drama is excavated from this tightrope of having to toe the line for fear of political, social, and sometimes fatal backlash. It can be emotionally intense. But for most of A Frozen Flower, unfortunately, this is so underutilized. This leads us to the next question. Is this film dramatic? Frankly, a lot of the dramatic stakes are not effectively executed. There's a subplot about treacherous plottings amongst officials against the king that pops up occasionally that you kind of forget. Ultimately, it doesn't do much for the overall story, and certain beats could have been set up differently in order to contribute to the actual central plot, that being the dynamics between the 3 leads. The pacing is also an issue. It's not steady or contemplative enough to immerse me historically, nor does it provide the love story between the Queen and the Royal Guard any foundation. In the film's opening scene, the principal themes are made clear. A Frozen Flower is going to explore what it means to be an ideal subject under an absolute monarchy, how this ideal can be complicated by personal desires, and what happens when this clash affects not just individuals, but an entire nation. So this film has to get a few things correct in order to work. We have to see the monarchy feel its power and the sense of obligation. We have to see a compelling case for personal desires, in this case love, and it must be potent and consuming. This is a desire that can topple a king, so it's gotta be good. And this film just utterly fails at that. Plus, the story waits until the final act to throw in a drastic character turn for the king. Most of this can be attributed to the clunky writing, but I also wasn't too impressed by the performances. So let's ask our final question. Is this film erotic? What's considered erotic is largely subjective. For personal definition, erotic isn't simply sex scenes or nudity or sexuality. Erotic is tactile, sensual, emotional, and intimate. Sexual eroticism doesn't necessarily require love, but it should consider attraction and most importantly get across as convincingly as possible the emotion of desire, the appeal for pleasure whether it's fulfilled or denied. Actors' performances don't usually achieve this on their own, but work in harmony with cinematography, directing, editing, sound, and writing. By that personal criteria, A Frozen Flower is not particularly erotic. In viewer reactions to this film, the negative responses decry the sex scenes as unnecessary, disgusting, vomit-worthy, and pornographic. Those reactions actually piqued my interest, but they're not an accurate reflection of the film. The conflict of the film is how sex and love change the dynamics among 3 people, but it's couched in the context of national stability and upheaval. There's a single-sex scene between the king and the royal guard, and admittedly, the scene is very dry. literally and figuratively. It's kind of awkward and ambiguous, like smashing two dolls together. The sex scenes between the Queen and the Royal Guard, which are a majority of their scenes together, at first are horrific and uncomfortable because they aren't consensual, but the lack of connective tissue to establish an emotional connection or character motivation just kills any development and possible reading of erotic desire. Overall, A Frozen Flower is a hollow film. The writing and pacing don't provide the time to establish or communicate the lust, romance, or love that the story is promising. Instead, it's flat, uninspired, and doesn't even reach porn levels of believability. If it had taken the route of creating a true palace drama, where the royal class is trapped in a suffocating and repressive environment, where these tightly coiled characters with constrictive lives could succumb to building attraction, until lust and the intensity of long-suppressed emotion lead to a liberating yet destructive finale, the individual desires and national obligation crash and collide dramatically. Instead, what we get is hackneyed, unconvincing, and lacking emotional payoff. Furthermore, the excuse of historical accuracy completely loses weight when you realize how many liberties the film takes in the first place to drum up such tepid drama. And the only reason I'm not giving this film an F is because it manages to be less boring than Method, which has a lot of the same character issues. The final 20 minutes of A Frozen Flower are at least kind of interesting because it goes completely off the rails. To give you an idea, let's end this review on A Frozen Flower's content warnings: nudity, graphic explicit sex scenes, coerced sexual assault, multiple politically motivated massacres or purges, a couple duels and assassination attempts, and finally, castration. A Frozen Flower is widely available, such as on Viki or Amazon Prime for a small rental fee, or for free on Tubi with ads. However, despite its accessibility, I don't personally suggest watching this movie. Instead, if you want a steamy, palace-set historical drama about affairs and lines of succession, I'd recommend the Danish A Royal Affair. If you want a solid Korean erotic historical drama with complicated love triangles and dynamics, I'd recommend Untold Scandal. And if you want a Korean period drama that challenges oppressive structures and repressive tradition with eroticism and queerness, you could not go wrong with the absolute perfection of The Handmaiden. Okay, now I'm going to dig a little deeper into the film's highly questionable representation choices. Warning, there will be spoilers ahead. But first, I'd like to set some basic historical context. Although honestly, I'm struggling with how much of it I should include because the film itself really didn't care about it either. 1. The film is set during the Goryeo dynasty, or rather in the Kingdom of Goryeo, which was founded in the early 10th century and lasted until the 14th century, whereafter it was succeeded by the Joseon dynasty. Some well-known dramas set during the Goryeo period include Moon Lovers, Past Life Sequences of Goblin, and My Country New Age. 2. Goryeo also had a pretty strict class structure, informed by Confucian principles, and was largely inflexible and immobile, with the king at the top. 3. Along this class structure, you also had the system of patriarchy, which, although less conservative than that of the later Joseon dynasty, still emphasized the importance of gender roles, and for royal women placed an emphasis on the political benefits of marriage and maintaining the line of succession. 4. By the 13th century, the kingdom had become a vassal state to the Mongol Yuan dynasty, despite successfully staving off multiple invasions, likely because Goryeo had been plagued by corruption, rebellion, and unrest. A vassal state is a state with varying degrees of independence in its internal affairs, but dominated by another state in its foreign affairs, and potentially wholly subject to the dominating state. 5. As a semi-autonomous vassal state, Goryeo was under more Mongol influence on culture and society, and when it came to governance, the two were very intermingled. Lastly, 6. At this time, Goryeo princes were usually held, mostly hostage, in the Mongol court. When they were ready to ascend the throne in their native countries, they were married to a Mongol princess. So you can see how national affairs, marriage, culture, citizenship, and power coalesced. More specifically, A Frozen Flower takes place at the very end of the Goryeo period in the 14th century, and serves as a loose dramatization of the reign of King Gongmin. King Gongmin was born in Goryeo in 1330, sent as a hostage to the Mongol courts in 1341, at age 11, married to a Mongol princess in 1349, at age 19, and ascended the throne in 1351, at age 21. His reign ended very suddenly in 1374 when he was just 44 years old. Something important to note is that about midway through his rule, the Yuan dynasty was crumbling, and for much of Gongmin's reign he wielded his power to reform Goryeo by divesting it from Yuan and decreasing their influence. Then throw in the obligation to produce his successor, numerous consorts, a serf or slave woman who ended up birthing the future king, the discontent of aristocrats and entrenched bureaucracy, a Buddhist scholar turned advisor turned de facto ruler, mental instability caused by grief and loss, and to the interests of this channel, the king's relationships with multiple royal guards. I'm breaking this section into 3 case studies to examine how queerness in the film is characterized, represented, and utilized in a historical setting. A Frozen Flower's first 5 minutes are an excellent introductory case study for why I felt an almost immediate cause for concern. The opening text informs the viewer that the king established a training commune on palace grounds for boy children who would eventually grow up to be his royal guards, so that they could be in reach. The opening scene then shows his fixation on a specific child, who would then become his lover. What a sentence. He shows him special attention and gives him individual training. At this time, the child would have been around 11 years old, and the king would have been at least 19 years old. To me, it's clear that the film is implying that the king deliberately surrounded himself with prepubescent boys for personal motivations. Implicitly, those reasons are grooming and coercive sexual relationships. The king, even at 19, is completely ambivalent to his bride's arrival from Yuan and would prefer to spend solitary time with this boy. Later in the film, the queen admits she was cold to the guard because she's always resented him for monopolizing the king's affections. Mind you, they originally met when he was a literal child. From the get-go, the timeline is completely off. Gongmin and the queen were already married before he returned to Goryeo to become king. Reportedly, they were very attached. However, the king took his first royal concubine 5 years into their marriage because they were not conceiving an heir. He took another 1 year after that. The queen would eventually die due to complications from a stillborn birth in 1365. And after that, his mental health suffered greatly, and he turned governing over to a monk and/or scholar for the next 6 years. In this time, he also took 3 more royal concubines, none of which he conceived a child with. In 1371, he had that same scholar executed in order to rein in and reclaim his royal power. In 1372, he formed his royal guard, made up of teenage boys to young men from noble families. The events of A Frozen Flower take place from 1373 to 1374, specifically when he commanded at least 6 or more of these guards, allegedly, to consummate with his royal concubines in order to conceive a child. One concubine did end up getting pregnant. The king was then assassinated. In the end, a child he had with a woman named Banya, alternately called a slave or serf, ended up taking the throne. So, A Frozen Flower takes select historical events. 1. The king and the queen could not conceive a child. 2. The king reportedly had sexual relationships with his royal guards later in life. 3. The king allegedly used his royal guards to resolve the succession issue. And 4. The king was then murdered. Then it sews these together in a dramatized narrative of lust, love, and betrayal. I'm saying all of this to get across how much liberty the story took, how it chose its own creative direction, and how it narrativized historical events with particular themes in mind. Filmmaking and storytelling are always a series of choices. The movie's timeline is constructed with specific characterizations and plot arcs in consideration, ending in intimate treachery and tragedy, regardless of the implications. Monarchy presents a very complicated scenario of consent versus coercion. As the king, the likelihood of anyone saying no to a request or direct order is probably low. He's the head of state, father of the country, and refusing could mean negative consequences, let alone potential death. Added to that, the guard character has known him since he was a child. So there's a conditioned deference as a close older male in his life as well as being king. The guard grew up away from his parents, in the palace, and under the close observation of the king. And at some point, when the relationship became romantic or sexual, could he really have refused? Would he have been able to conceptualize saying no? Not really. So if we see the relationship between the king and the guard as coercive, and we look to the end of the film where the guard confesses that he never once loved the king, felt anything for him romantically, and any feelings were the king's delusion alone, then we have no choice but to label this dynamic as having been the result of grooming, and any sexual situation therein as sexual assault. This, coupled with the singular sex scene allowed between the king and the guard very early in the film, which is clearly not framed as erotic in comparison to the 5 to 6 sex scenes that follow between the guard and the queen, it presents a very bizarre double standard. So why then is the relationship between the guard and the queen allowed to be love? It begins as forced sex between two people who don't like each other, actively resent each other, know nothing about each other, and who share very minimal scenes together aside from sexual rendezvous. They're both sexual assault victims, since it's the king that orders them to have sex. The first attempt shows both parties feeling humiliated and objectified, reluctant and uncomfortable. The queen cries, won't make eye contact, and attempts to disassociate. The guard gives up. The second and third attempt, both as the king waits outside the room but is visible through the mulberry paper door, are successful. After that, they're in love, I guess. Willing to throw everything they've ever known and sworn allegiance to their whole lives completely out the window. Willing to die for it. And from their love, only now does pregnancy happen. A pregnancy grounded in a strange double standard for what counts as sexual assault and what counts as love, arbitrarily set against lines of sexuality. But what of the king? What do the creative choices show his character to be? In the film, we learn these things about the king in this order. He's capable of attraction to or fixation on children. He's ambivalent and sometimes rude to women. He's generally soft-voiced and mild-tempered. If it regards his lover, he's easy to persuade. He's discouraging of heterosexual bonds involving his male subjects, considering it disloyalty. His relationships with men, or his orientation, make him both impotent and implicitly infertile. To him, glory and honor are unimportant if they oppose his orientation. He's willing to disregard royal duties and become a puppet king with no power or agency as proof of these beliefs. He's incredibly manipulative. He orders the sexual assault of the person he loves and another person he cares about. He voyeuristically oversees it. Despite this, he's very jealous, needy, and persistently nags. He consistently tests people. He puts himself in superfluous danger, not to weed out political enemies, but to see his lover. He takes risks to make personal points. He's paranoid. This paranoia is strongly linked with issues of trust and loyalty. He's violent. He's sadistic. He castrates his lover. He actively participates in torture and oversees mass executions. He enjoys the spectacle of his own destructiveness. Finally, he meets his demise at the end of a sword. Interestingly, when it comes to the king, A Frozen Flower takes a modern approach to sexuality. Typically, we wouldn't use common terms for sexual orientation like gay, straight, etc., because sexual identity wasn't conceptualized or articulated historically like it is today. Individual identity was less of a consideration. Behavior, preferences, desires, relationships, yes, but self-determined and ascribed identity, much less so. Plus, members of the ruling class were expected to fulfill certain hetero-patriarchal duties to maintain or grow rank, status, power, wealth, and influence. Namely, marry and have children. Hereditary monarchy relied on political marriages and continued lines of succession. I'm not saying resistance or refusal was impossible, but it wasn't common according to what we know. But the king, in this film, is not just having sexual or romantic relationships with men. He's gay. Not even queer or bisexual. Gay. He has a sexual identity, determined by his singular and exclusive attraction, romantic and sexual, to other men. It's not a portrayal of historical queerness as much as it's an application of modern identity politics onto a historical figure. But the end result isn't a dynamic modernization or fresh understanding of ancient history. It's a rocky foundation for problematic queer representation. The entire source of the film's conflict, national stability, is the fact that he's a gay king. The historical record shows his main issues, the ones that led to his death, or probably his deliberate distancing from the dominant state, the crumbling Yuan dynasty evident in his policies, his handing over of the government to literally some guy for 6 years after the death of the queen, the discontent of numerous nobles and bureaucrats, and the succession crisis. He also had drama going with land grant systems, opposition to his reforms, pirates, and rebels. His alleged relationships with men were barely making the top 10. But A Frozen Flower consolidates all national issues and threats under the umbrella of the king's sexuality. Because he's gay, he can't have sex with women. He can't procreate, and he is dishonorable. He's not active, vital, or virile. He's passive, impotent, and infertile. He cannot fulfill royal or patriarchal duties. Instead, he resorts to violation, manipulation, and humiliation. His relationship with a man and subsequent betrayal drives him to sadism and his own death. And that's not even touching the grooming implications. His sexual identity is both disease and symptom of national crises. And that's such a dark place to go creatively, because it manages to be both historically inaccurate and creatively dangerous. I don't mean dangerous as in radical, provocative, or transgressive, but as in thoughtlessly prejudiced. And I do mean thoughtless. I don't think this was intentional, largely because I think the subject of the king's sexuality was mostly a gimmick they didn't take seriously. Like if the king was impotent or sterile and the guard was just a close friend or brother, nothing would change that much. It's like when you're watching a drama and there's that obligatory love triangle where the second male lead truly stands no chance, but you sit through it anyway. He's a fixture, a trope, but just creates artificial and superficial conflict that's generically expected, if inconsequential. Just some guy. The king's sexuality is just as ill-considered and inessential, and so is a frozen flower. Until next time, goodbye, farewell, and 안녕히 계세요.